Hello. Today we are going to start our discussion on neural networks, and I know many of you are excited and have been patiently waiting for us to get to neural networks. However, before moving on, I'm going to relate it to everything we have covered so far. And the only thing you need to remember from our previous lectures in order to understand everything in neural networks is the representation, evaluation, and optimization framework. Remember, for any machine learning model can be broken down into three parts: representation, evaluation, and optimization. With representation being how does a machine learning model take an input and generate an output? What is the structure of that machine learning model, and how can we write it as in the form of a mathematical function so that we can have an abstraction of how it takes an input and generates an output. Now, the output of the neural network or any other machine learning model needs to be compared to a supervisory signal, let's say a training label, and we can compute the error over the output of the machine learning model and the target that we have, and what is called evaluation. So, a very simple way of evaluating how good or bad a particular machine learning model is for a given example is simply to subtract the output from the target that we have been given as part of the training data, square that, and then that becomes your loss function. And in the third bit, or optimization of the machine learning model, we are interested in finding out what parameters how can we tune the parameters in the machine learning model so that for our training data set, the neural network or any other machine learning model produces an output that matches the training data. Different optimization strategies can be used, such as gradient descent. You can use other types of optimizers as well. Sometimes you can even get a closed form solution, but that doesn't matter, right? Remember, the goal of learning using training data is to tune the parameters, in this case of the machine learning model, so that its output matches the supervisory signal if it is available for a given training data set. But that's not the end goal. Our end goal is to use this process, adjust the parameters so that we can guarantee generalization over an unseen test set. And that is the learning problem here. Optimization is a necessary step to get to generalization, but is not a sufficient one. Most of the time and energy we spend in developing machine learning models is spent actually at ensuring generalization, or ensuring that these machine learning models generalize to different type of test inputs. Okay, so in terms of neural networks, the evaluation and optimization bits are pretty much everything that can also be done for other types of machine learning models. It's the representation that changes, and it changes in really significant ways, and it allows us to develop a very rich representation in neural networks that allows us to solve a variety of problems, and that's what we're going to learn through this lecture series. However, we're going to start with how did we arrive at artificial neural networks, taking inspiration from biological neurons and biological networks. If you view the body of any organism that has a nervous system, just like the body that you see on the left hand side of this is a drawing of the human nervous system that was painstakingly drawn by a medical student back in 1925, I think. It's available on the internet, and they've drawn each and every nerve in the human body. So we have nerves that allow us to see. We have these receptors in our eyes so that when light falls on them, they trigger an electrical impulse that gets transferred to our brain, and that allows us to see things outside. Similarly, we have neurons, or we have these receptors in our skin that allow us to feel touch, and there are other neurons and structures that allow us to hear. The basic unit of this nervous system, or in any organism, is our cells called neurons. And people had known about neurons for a long while, and they'd been studying it, trying to figure out how are we able to perceive things, how are we able to think, and so on. However, artificial neural networks, or the neural networks that we as machine learning experts are interested in, are an inspiration or derived from these biological networks. They're a loose model of these biological neurons. So what we are going to do is to try to understand what is the structure of a single neuron or a biological neuron. It's pretty simple. Although at the same time, there are whole subject areas, for example, neural biology that or neurobiology that we are in which we study the structure of neurons and how these function. So I'm going to be grossly oversimplifying the structure of a neuron over here. If you think of a neuron as a single cell, and like any other biological cell, it has a cell body which has a nucleus, as you can see over here. So this is a nucleus, this is a cell body. The neuron has a set of branches coming out of its cell body that are called dendrites, and we're going to talk about the role of those, but let's first try to understand the structure of these. Then it has this long branch or a tail that is called an axon, which terminates in a set of other branches that we are going to call axon terminals or axon termini. Okay, so we have this axon and we have these small branches. So that is the basic structure of a biological neuron. Now, a neuron is able to sense things from its surroundings or from other neurons through these axon terminals. And so these axon terminals are going to be connected to the dendrites of other neurons. So you got a dendrite over here of this neuron, but if you have other neurons, then you have their dendrites. So these dendrites of this neuron, for example, can be connected to the axon termini of this other neuron. And that is how a biological network, neural network, is formed. You have got the output of a biological neuron, which is transmitted through these dendrites, passing on to the axon terminal of another neuron. So a neuron is able to produce an electrical signal at these dendrites. That is when we call a neuron firing. So if this neuron, for example, generates an electrical impulse, the same impulse is transmitted to other neurons to which this particular neuron is going to be connected to over these. So these dendrites of this one are going to connect to the axon terminal of another neuron. Okay, so anything that this neuron now produces is transmitted over these dendrites onto the other neuron. So if a neuron generates an electrical signal, it gets transmitted to another neuron. However, there is a small gap between, let's say, if this is the dendrite of one of them, and this is the axon terminal of the another one, and then there is an electrical impulse coming over here. Let's call it X, and then there's a small gap in between the two, which is called a synaptic gap, or you can say a synapse over here. Synaptic gap. This synaptic gap, what it does is that it modulates this input signal. So it essentially changes this input signal that it is receiving, and it changes it, let's say, by an amount or a factor W, so that the transmission of this signal then becomes this Wx. So if you think of a single neuron, it's connected to all these other neurons, and those neurons, if they generate a signal X, at the synaptic gap of the two neurons, there is some electrical signal transduction or modulation taking place through the exchange of some ions. What that does is it modulates that input signal, and the signal that is received by the other neuron is now modulated by a certain amount that we've captured or we have modeled as Wx. So what a certain neuron does now is that it receives its input from all of these other neurons and it accumulates them to create what is called a net input. And if that net input exceeds a certain value, then this particular neuron is going to generate an output, or what is called it fires. That is, it generates its own output, which then is passed on to other neurons and so on. So this is how, at a very hand-waving way, or by grossly oversimplifying this problem, this is how these neural networks function. This is the sort of model that we need to understand in order to develop a mathematical model or understand how a very simple neural model is used in neural networks that we are going to study. So with that, we're going to move on to how we model a single neuron mathematically. So as I said earlier, you have all of these dendrites, you have those axon terminals. Each of these dendrites is connected to the axon terminal of another neuron, and so on. So if a certain neuron, let's say neuron J, I'm gonna make cartoon representations of multiple neurons here. Let's say we've got a neuron I over here, and then we've got a neuron J over here. Okay. If this neuron produces an output that is xj, then this output xj can be passed on to this neuron if these two neurons are connected, but there exists a small gap between the two, right? That gap, of course, is called the synaptic gap. That's what we talked about. It modulates this input signal, and before it is absorbed or received by this neuron I. And let's say we model this modulation by multiplication of this xj with a weight that we are going to call wij. If this weight is 0, there is no connection between the two. If this weight is positive, the input that is received, that xj, gets multiplied by a positive factor and becomes larger. If let's say this is negative, then that input becomes negative, and so on. So this is where the modulation takes place. A particular neuron from this neuron that is received by this neuron I then becomes wij times xj. However, this neuron is also connected to other neurons. Let's say if j is equal to 1, then we can say that the net input is wi1 x1. But we can have other neurons as well, right, that it is connected to. Let's say if there is this neuron that I'm going to call j is equal to 2, then what happens is that there's going to be a synaptic gap over here that I'm going to call wi2, and if this generates x2, so the net input from the modulated input from that then becomes wi2 x2, and so on. So this neuron I of our primary interest is receiving all of these inputs, and once it has received all of these inputs, what it does is that it sums all of these inputs, these weighted inputs. So what we are going to do is for all inputs, or from all neurons that this neuron I is connected to, we are going to do a weighted summation of their inputs. Okay, so that's what's going on over here. We have got an output from a neuron called xj, and then that gets multiplied with a weight wij, and all of these inputs are weighted, and then they are summed to produce what is called a net input. So I'm just going to call it, to simplify, I'm just going to call it net input. Now if this input is above a certain threshold, let's say if it is positive, then what happens is that we model that the neuron fires, or it generates an output of y is equal to +1. If it is not, if it is below a certain threshold, let's say 0, we say that the neuron does not fire. Okay, so this is a very simplistic model of how a biological neuron functions. There are a lot of other details that we haven't captured. So this is a very simplistic model, or an abstraction of the biological neuron. So all you need to remember in order to understand this is a certain neuron takes in weighted summations of inputs from other neurons, sums it up, applies a function to it that we are going to call a nonlinearity or an activation function, and then it generates its output. So let's take an example. Let's say you've got a neuron over here which is connected to these two other neurons only. Okay, and let's say this neuron is producing a signal whose value is 2, and let's say this neuron is producing a signal whose value is -1, and then that gets transferred over to this neuron, and then this one gets transferred over to this neuron as well. Let's say the weight value for this one, let's call this neuron 1, okay, and let's call this neuron 2. The weight of the first neuron, the connection is, let's say it's equal to 4, and then the weight of the second one is equal to 5. Then what happens is that w1 gets multiplied with x1, which is 2, and w2 gets multiplied with x2, which is equal to -1. So 4 times 2 plus 5 times -1 becomes the net input of this neuron over here. And in this case, that comes out to be 3. So this is your net input. We are going to call that u. just the net input. Because this net input is now positive, it is greater than 0, so the neuron, this particular neuron, is then going to produce an output, let's say, of +1. Okay? So that is sort of the basic model or structure of an artificial neuron. So if you break it down into three parts, there a neuron receives inputs from its connected neurons. Each of those inputs is weighed by a certain amount, and we compute a summation of all of these. We accumulate all of these weighted inputs to compute the net input UI of this neuron. Nonlinearity is then applied, or let's say in this case, a step function is applied onto this particular net input, and then this neuron produces an output depending upon whether that net input was above a certain threshold or below a certain threshold. There can be other types of nonlinearities as well, as we shall see. So this is called an activation function, which determines how a network generates, how a neuron generates its output. So those are the three basic parts. If we break it down, this summation of these products, so it's a sum of products, so we can write it as a dot product. So if we represent all the weights of a given neuron as in a vector wi, and we represent all the inputs that it is receiving in the vector x, the net input is simply w transpose x or wi transpose x. Okay, and then what happens is that an activation function that we are calling f over here is applied on this net input to generate an output. So those are the two major steps that you need to remember in order to understand this simple biological model, this simple mathematical model of a biological neuron.